Hey everybody, so today's recording stopped midway through the class, so I'm going to try to recreate this, particularly for the students who are joining us asynchronously, but also for those who might want a little recap of what we went over in class today. So where the audio cut out today was around this point where I was going through this section and talking about my layer ordering and my layer organization. And I was about to say that the reason we keep our layers super organized in Photoshop is not just for ourselves and our own organization, but for the sake of other people who we might pass this file along to in the future. If you're working in a firm or on a group project, you're probably going to be passing along your files between different people a lot. And it's just a good practice to keep things named and organized so that everybody has an easy time navigating the file and figuring out where are the things that they need to use. So whenever you add a layer to a project or create a new layer, it's good practice to just give it a descriptive name. You can see that I have a bunch of folders, and inside those folders are other folders and then other specific layers. As you work in Photoshop, you'll begin to understand how layers are created and why it's so important to keep them organized. But just for the sake of today's class, know that when you have a layer, you can just double click it and that will access the editing tool, so you can change the name or add to it. And then if you want to join different layers into a folder, you can just use this folder button here. That will create a new group, and you can double click that and give it a new name. And then you can just drag layers or other folders into that group. If you want to get rid of it, you can just highlight that and click on the garbage can down here. So as we keep going through these different layers, you see that these elements become added. I have a scale bar over here for the section, and then I have a light and color layer at the end. So I'll go on to the next thing. This is a plan. This is line work that has been imported from a PDF. The PDF was exported from AutoCAD. And if I zoom in, I'm just going to press Control 1 to zoom into 100%. I can press down the space bar to access the hand tool, which will allow me to pan just by clicking with my mouse. So you can see here that the line work looks quite complicated. There are a variety of paths and green spaces and roads and networks, parking lots, buildings, etc. There's also contour lines. So line work can get a little bit complicated, but it's pretty easy to use line work in Photoshop. Later in our class today, Jonathan was asking about selecting within line work. So as long as you're on the line work layer, you can use what is called the magic wand tool in Photoshop. That's this tool right here. And if you just click down on this, it'll show you all of the selection tools. There's a couple different ones you can use, but the magic wand tool will allow you to click within an area and it will select that area as long as it's within a closed polyline. So for example, if I hold down Shift, I can add to my selection. And if I wanted to do something with all of these planted areas, like maybe I want to fill them with a texture or fill them with a color, then I can select them as long as I'm on the line work layer and the line work is made up of closed polylines. Then Photoshop will automatically detect the edges of my selection. To deselect, you can just press Control D. So I've just pressed Control minus to zoom out. And if you want to fit a canvas into your window, you can press Control 0. That will just fit the whole thing into your window. And let's just go through some of the other layers that are here. Once we have selections made, we can fill those with colors, like I have with these layers, and then add patterns of textures over top of those fills. So that's how we kind of get this basic water and grass and vegetation areas. And I have other fills. They are the paths and the bike lanes and some of the wood decking and some of the other materials on the site. We also have trees. So all of these trees are just individual PNG files that I've dragged into Photoshop and given a shadow to. But essentially Photoshop is just about combining different elements from different sources and layering them on top of each other. In the accessories, we have some umbrellas and people, and then there are things that we can add on top, like overlays and textures. Of course, one of the most famous things that we use Photoshop for is to combine renderings into our views. So we have a background rendering of this site plan, which comes from Lumion, and it has also been montaged into this view to sort of match the line work that's there and add some more realistic shadows and vegetation to this plan. And on the top, I have a sort of lighting adjustment layer that just kind of highlights and shifts the colors so that they're a little bit warmer. So this is kind of how we build up a rendered plan. Obviously, when we're thinking about what we could use Photoshop for, visualizations are top of mind. Just like all of the other drawings that I've shown you, we can use Photoshop to build up according to a sketch. So this view started as just a simple sketch like this that I've dragged into Photoshop and used as a guide for developing the rest of the view. The sketch has lots of notes on it to kind of say what should go where. And if we take a look at all these layers, I'm just going to go down to the very basic, which starts with a rendering. This base rendering comes from Lumion, and it's not a super highly detailed model. I have some boxes here for buildings. This is probably the most detailed part. It is also just boxes with reflective planes for windows. And the ground plane has a few textures associated with it, but they're not super highly realistic. So this rendering is just a sort of base image that we use to build on top of. After that, I've added in some textures of art to go along this wall in the back. We have some umbrellas with coloring on top of them. And then in the next folder, we have our paving and vegetation. These are all just photo textures that have been manipulated according to the ground plane. We have trees in next. These are all cutout textures that I've dropped into Photoshop and then given different opacities and blend modes so that they kind of fit into this space. We have some background planting, we have some furnishings, and all of the furnishings are just PNG files that have been dragged and dropped into the folder and then arranged on the canvas. We have our people who kind of populate this space. These ones are just simple silhouettes. And then we have some of the finishing touches, these billboards, a grunge texture, and then color and light adjustments that kind of go over top and unify the whole thing at the end. All this was built on this sketch, and then different elements like the 3D elements, the rendered elements, and the photo elements were all dragged in and just manipulated within this canvas to kind of blend together. Here's another example of a rendering. This one started with a really basic rendering from V-Ray. This was provided by a client, and obviously this is not ideal. It has some planting, but it doesn't look very nice. It has some architectural elements, but it's missing a lot of information. So I was asked to help develop this for a competition, and I was able to pull this together in an afternoon. Once you are familiar with the tools of Photoshop, you'll be able to work pretty quickly within it. And just like the other files that I've shown you, it's all about building things up in layers. So we have paving and vegetation, trees, people, and then finally a light and color adjustment layer that kind of unifies everything at the end. So one of the things that we use Photoshop for a lot in architecture and landscape architecture is to cut out assets. So if we want to be able to put in things into our views, for example, let's say we want to be able to put in these different types of people, we need to be able to cut out those people to begin with. So those people, they don't come pre-cut out. Usually we find them somewhere on the internet as a reference. The same with trees. We find these as images online, and they have backgrounds like skies and ground planes and everything. And we need to know how to cut those out. I'm going to also just throw in a person here just to kind of show you how that gets cut out. So I just drag the file to Photoshop and it opens up. The easiest way to select something in Photoshop is to use the object selection tool, and we can find that in this toolbar over here by just holding down and then selecting the object selection tool. This is going to allow us to drag a box around the thing that we would like to select, and Photoshop uses artificial intelligence to define the boundaries of what we want to select. As you can see, it's done a pretty good job finding these people and creating a selection around them. If you want to double check your selection, you can press Q. That's going to bring you into what's called a quick mask. The mask is red. Red shows you all the unselected areas, and the non-red areas are what has been selected. And you could go in and you could use different tools to sort of refine that selection. So if I wanted to refine this selection, I might use a brush. I just press B for brush and right click and find a hard brush like this, make it pretty small, maybe like that. And then I could go in and just brush in the areas that I don't want to be part of my selection so that this just gets a little bit more refined. And if I want to erase some of this red mask, I just press E for eraser, and I can right click and go back to my hard brush again, just reduce the size of it. And I can go down here and erase this red mask out from the boot and from these fingers. And if I'm happy with my selection, I just press Q again to get out of my quick mask. I'm going to press Control-0 to make my canvas fit to the screen. And then I'll press Control-J, which is duplicate. So that's going to take my selection and put it on its own layer. And now if I turn off the background, I can see that these raincoat people are isolated. They're on their own layer. And if I use my selection tool, I can drag them around and manipulate them. So I could save this just as a PNG on its own so that I can use it as its own resource in the future. Or I can go back to, let's go back to the rendering that I was working on before. If I want to, I can just drag those people into this canvas, and there they are. So now I would add those into my people layer down here. Obviously, these people are not in the right season and not at the right location to be in the rain, but you can see that that's how you can cut out assets in Photoshop and then add them to another view. So in this one, I just used what's called the Polygonal Lasso, which is this selection tool over here. You can access it by pressing L on your keyboard. And then you just basically click to select the areas that you want to select. So I'm going to create an outline all the way around this bench. I'm going to do kind of a loose outline so it's not super perfect. And you can see that when I reach the end of my line, Photoshop makes this little circle, which means I can close the selection. If I want to remove a piece from the selection, for example, this paved area here, I can just hold down Alt and then select within that paving area that I want to remove, like that. Now I have a pretty clean selection around this bench, and I'll press Control-J and turn off my background, and now I have a really nice selection of this bench. So if I wanted to use that in a perspective view, I could save this as a PNG for later, or I could drag it right into another canvas and begin using it.